Chigozie Obioma is a multi-award winning writer and an associate professor in the Department of English at the University of Nebraska, Lincoln. He has won the NAACP Award for a debut book, the LA Times Art Seidenbaum Award for first fiction, and the inaugural FT Oppenheimer Award, just to name a few. Both his novels, The Fisherman and An Orchestra of Minorities, were shortlisted for the Man Booker Prize for fiction. His books feature on innumerable best books lists and have been reviewed in a number of publications, including The New Yorker, The Wall Street Journal, and The Guardian newspaper. Alice Walker, author of The Color Purple, described Chigozie's writing as so crisp, the story so unusual that I couldn't put the book down, whilst reviewers in the New York Times have referred to him as the heir to Chinua Achebe. Okay, so thank you so much, Chigozie, for joining us today and to discuss your work. So our guiding theme is around notions of disruption. So this will inform a number of questions I ask you, but of course it won't limit the conversation. So in thinking about your writing and thinking about the two novels that you've published, The Fisherman and An Orchestra of Minorities, one of the things that sort of comes to the fore in both texts is the realm of the supernatural, and the supernatural and its relationship to the sort of the land of the humans, I suppose, and the kind of overlapping that takes place, and the sort of pulls, the way in which the supernatural realm impacts upon the lives of human beings. And so in beginning to think about, an opening question around disruptions or around the ways in which our lives are impacted, I wonder if you can speak to what draws you to the sort of spiritual realm, and in thinking about that in relation to the lives of your characters and sort of what governs them.
Well, Deme to the people of you and Yvonne, Igbo Conference. I'm a big fan of your work and activities. So it's a pleasure to participate in the conference. So I came to writing partly because I was told these stories by, my parents, especially my dad. And some of the earlier stories that I heard was interested in were the stories about the Igbo myth, stories like that of Ojadili, which is the most common one, but you had ones that were very localized to the people of Bende in Abia State. So stories about one guy who actually was a relative of ours, one of our ancestors, called Mbotu, Mbotu means noise. So he was a disruptive force in himself, and his escapades are interesting. So stories like that, one thing I discovered about stories like that was that in almost all of them, none of the interactions were exclusive to what you could call the physical realm. So, and the reason for that is because at the very heart of the Igbo worldview is that nothing can exist by itself. There is a radical dualism to the way that our ancestors saw the world. So the philosophy of the Igbo people has been central to my work, as you know, especially the An Orchestra of Minorities. So Egbebelu Gwepelu is the fundamental axiomatic principle of the Igbo worldview. So the idea is that there is a subordinate structure to whatsoever is in existence. So which means that the Igbo saw things in twos. For instance, the word for enjoyment, for partying, oriri na nkwari, is in two, so you have to eat and then dance. There are things like that. I can't remember some of them off the top of my head, but there are terms that are together, If, for instance, the idea of the compound or the family, ezi na ụlọ, so so that's what you would just refer to as maybe neighborhood, or yard in the English language. But no, the interior and the exterior is how the Igbo saw it. So which means that for every physical thing or any object that is palpable, there is a dual spiritual one. So which also means that for anything to actually exist in the world, there is a spiritual existence prior to the manifestation in the world. So which means that if a human being exists, there will be a chi, a spiritual body. So this worldview is central to my work, and this is why you have these things, you have these stories, in The Fisherman as well as An Orchestra of Minorities.
And just sort of building on that, there's an interesting conversation that takes place in both your works on sort of the idea of what's preordained or what's prophesized. And your characters, to a certain degree, don't seem to be in control of or in full control of their destinies. There seems to be a sense of things being mapped out for them, and there's them sort of realizing, what has already been preordained. And so I wanted to speak to that, or wanted you to speak to that, but also in relation to the very tragic elements in your writing. So both of your texts are quite tragic. I mean, you have characters whose struggles, throughout the texts end in often it's death, and it's sort of quite you're sort of rooting for these characters to be able to break through, and then it has quite a sort of heavy or weighty, quite dark endings to it. And so I wonder if in terms of your writing and your vision in your writing, if you can speak to this idea of the preordained and where it sits within sort of the tragic elements of your writing.
Yeah. One thing I have to quickly mention that I didn't touch upon because again, the idea of the Igbo worldview as it is realized in my work is a very large topic. I could speak on it for an hour. So, but what I do, or what I try to do, is to bring in, because I feel like the understanding of the world today is Western. So the West, like it or not, we all say, okay, we are activists, and you have people, saying all kinds of things, writing books about how they are decolonizing, they are this. The very hermeneutic base from which you are beginning your critique from is a Western one. Is it the irony of all that? So what I want to do is disrupt. I want to challenge the fact that you can have a worldview that is not Western. So the actions, the way in which people live and react to things in my novels are from the Igbo world, even though we live in the present moment, which is like a modernized world in which Western principles, Western political system, Western ways of seeing the world is what is predominant. So in that sense, the supernatural, if you notice in my work, does not work in the same way as in magical realism novels or fantasy novels. The supernatural works without disrupting the natural course of nature. So even though you have the supernatural in The Fisherman, for instance, okay, the idea of the prophecy, but it doesn't interfere with the natural course of things. If you look at the works of Gabriel Marquez, for instance, or magical realism, you will see, so somebody can be stabbed, and then the blood that gurges out from the person becomes an ocean and overwhelms an entire city. That is impossible. You see what I'm saying? Even though they're represented as a matter of fact. But in my work and in the Igbo worldview, you can have a character who is cursed. But the curse is something that, even though it's supernatural, but the person lives as if, because it's not palpable, the person lives as though that curse is in the air somewhere, just hovering. So we can decide that the boys actually kill each other in the fishermen, not because of Abulu's prophecy. While still, if you read the novel, you'll see that the Abulu's prophecy has something to do with it. So you can read it either ways. The same thing with the Chi in An Orchestra of Minorities. So you have the Chi living, walking, and interacting with spiritual forces on a different plane of existence, while Chinonso lives as you would have in any Western secular novel. There's no interference from the spiritual realm, even though he is surrounded by the supernatural. So I am writing a kind of, because people have been asking me, what would you categorize this work in? And I want to call it mystical realism, because that's the way we see the world. It's a realism that is mystical, but it's not fantastical. So that's one thing I want to say about that. So the question of whether the Igbo worldview supports a kind of fatalism is a different topic. I don't think that the question of fate is decided, really. What I think is that there's a dialectic between free will and fate. So people will say to you, for instance, and this was how I got interested in the idea of the Chi from the beginning. If I got sick as a child, in a very, something bad happened, my mom would say, well, how about yala Chi as a poor? This is a kind of a transaction between you and your Chi, which has resulted in this unfortunate event, which means that, and this is something that, this is how the Igbo people spoke and saw the world. But at the same time, sometimes they'll say, well, this person was not strong enough to overcome what the Chi had ordained for them. So I think, and then if you bring Things Fall Apart, for instance, into context, you look at Okonkwo, his Chi, Achebe argues that his Chi seemed not to have been one, whose, how did he say, the kola knot was not broken by the Chi itself. So, but this man, through sheer force of will, made himself a successful man, while his father, Unoka, was a man who seemed to have a strong Chi because at the beginning, because his Chi, gave him talent. So his Chi chose for him the ability to play. He was a flutist, and a well-regarded one. So if you had a weak Chi, you wouldn't be that talented. But because of his indolence, his Chi became weakened alongside him. So which means that even if you have some kind of destiny that would have occasioned you to be in a failure in life, by sheer force of will, you can overcome that. So I think that this is how the Igbo saw the world. So nothing really is preordained in the sense of being preordained, though we still also believe that most of the times, there is a kind of reincarnation of events. For instance, if you've seen something before, that thing can reincarnate, which is, in some ways, you can say that the gosling of An Orchestra of Minorities is Ndali come back to the world. So it's a mystical belief that things can reincarnate in different forms. So when that happens, it's a kind of preordained event, which sometimes you cannot do anything against. So this is one of the mysteries of Ordinary. and I, in both novels you see that. So we don't know whether it is really, Ikena's destiny, for instance, to die the way he does, or whether or not he could have worked against it.
And then just picking up on your discussion of Chi and your choice to have Nonso's Chi as narrator in An Orchestra of Minorities, I wondered, how did you approach that? I mean, the idea of writing a Chi as a character just seems overwhelming. So what was the processes that you went through, and how were you able to find the voice for the Chi as a character in this text?
Well, it was a difficult thing. I remember telling my friend Okendibe that I was going to attempt something like that, and the guy was like, how is that even possible? Until he read the book, of course. So, it was an audacious task, but I had told myself that I was going to do it. Because again, I feel like, many people have written cosmological novels. You look at in the Judeo-Christian tradition, John Milton's Paradise Lost, or Dante's Inferno, which explores the idea of hell and Hades. So, and I look, I'm like, okay, so we have all these things about, the Chi, for instance, or even some of the deities in the pantheon, Allah, for instance. So Allah is the biggest, deity in the Igbo pantheon. The earth itself is dedicated to Allah, Al-Igbo, for instance. So, so it's only subordinate to the supreme Chukwu, who some people even argue doesn't exist. So how do you then ignore all of that when we have it? So I said to myself, okay, I will write a novel that will not only be just a work of fiction, but a kind of a monument, because one of the things that colonialization has done to us in Nigeria is that in Africa, especially, colonialization was more aggressive than you had in India, for instance. So if you look at India, in fact, the British respected them to the extent that they even supported, building things like the Taj Mahal. They preserved the Indian, cosmological and religious beliefs, while ours was seen as a civilizing project. Black people who are monkeys and, inferior breed of human beings. Their civilization is nothing, which is therefore the greatness of things fall apart. So they came to clear out everything so that to the Igbo man, the very idea of Dinani or Menala or our practices became verboten. So when I was young, my parents would tell me, the worst people, the outcast, in society, like the American idea of the racists or the KKK, are those who imbibe the religion of our ancestors. These are the worst group of people. Don't greet them. Don't go to them. You see what I'm saying? So that is how the colonialism was so thorough that it completely made us see our own traditions as evil and theirs as great. So I want to create, so which means that most people of even my dad's generation do not know anything about the sophisticated cosmologies that their ancestors had. So I saw the book. I wanted to create a monument, a resource that people can come back to and find in there, in an accessible way. And what is more accessible than a novel? So, and I went as far as where there were gaps in the knowledge that is received about a particular cosmological or religious or cultural space. I filled it in. For instance, we believe generally in Igbo land that there is an ancestral hill, the space of where the ancestors go. But what does it look like? I could not, arrive at a consensus from the scant knowledge that is there. So in a chapter of An Orchestra of Minorities, I reconstructed the Igbo idea of heaven, from the scratch. So that's one of the reasons why I took on was a difficult task.
And then I'm just thinking about the inherent tensions of, as you said before, trying to move away from a kind of Eurocentric or Western notion or sense of how stories are told and how they're constructed, to try and really, particularly in An Orchestra of Minorities, immerse your text within a kind of Igbo worldview, at the same time writing in the English language, at the same time writing in novel form. So could you speak to sort of the tensions in doing that, and then sort of how you were able to craft something that was able to still be recognizable in novel form and sort of fit certain conventions of the novel, but also was able to develop your own project in capturing kind of Igbo cosmology and capturing other ways of seeing the world and being in the world?
Well, we have to accept that storytelling has always been there. It doesn't matter whether you told it through singing or through Tales by the Moonlight. But the novel is essentially a Western form. Its origin is Judeo-Christian in origin. So, and the way in which we see the arc of the novel is very Christian. So a character has to have some kind of desire, which forces them to make a move towards realizing that desire. And they often will come in contact with some impediments to it or barriers. And then that is what results in a conflict, which is then resolved. This is the basic arc of a story. And so for that to happen, though, it means that there is the idea of the free will is at the heart of it. The idea that you can actually choose to do something and then achieve it. What of if you lived in a theocracy where there is no, the idea of free will is very minimal. So the novel really cannot exist in the arc of the novel cannot form in that sense. So knowing all that, so I'm in many ways still working within that frame. That is why it is a novel. But at the same time, I feel that the novel, I take it literary. Literally. I always bite my tongue when I say that word. So the idea of the novel in French is something new, right? So I believe that each time I engage it, I should bring something new to the form. And honestly, I think that if there's any reason why my books have had a wide audience, is really because of that. People are interested in the way in which Benjamin tells the story, by association, for instance, to animals. My father is like an eagle, my mother is, this, that. And then, the chi here telling the story, which is something that I don't think anybody has tried before. So which is that, I feel like, okay, if I bring my own worldview into the novel, I would make it new. And that's really what the canons are. So every time you bring something into the canon of anything, whether it's art or literature, it changes the canon itself, because now this is a new way of seeing things. So if you introduce the first epistolatory novel into the canon, then going forward, people are like, wow, so an epistolatory novel can actually be considered a novel. So I think that the novel form is being changed. It's been changed every day. So now you can write a novel that is completely in the Igbo worldview, that which is where the dimensions of the tragic and fate and destiny comes in. Because if you look at An Orchestra of Minorities, it does not subscribe to the arc that I just described, because free will is suspect. So Chinonso could want to do something, but if in fact the Ndali is a Gosling reincarnating, and he is going to do the same thing that he did to the Gosling, because he loves it so much, he ends up destroying it, then he cannot do anything against it, you know, if we were to read it that way. So which means that the structures of the Western novel is disrupted, to use that word, in that novel. So that's what I'm trying to do.
And I'm just thinking about, I mean, you spoke about possibly classifying your work as a sort of mystical realism, and I think it's interesting just troubling that word, disrupting that word realism, because the idea that there are different forms of realism, that one person's idea of what's existing within their realm is different from another's. So the idea of the sort of spiritual as being part of someone's way of seeing the world, or being in the world, I think in itself is an interesting disruption. But I also wanted to ask you about the sense of responsibility you have when writing these kinds of novels, where you are drawing so heavily on belief systems or worldviews that haven't received the kind of respect that other worldviews or belief systems have. So in many ways, as you said, you're writing about sort of Igbo cosmology that many people aren't familiar with, or even Igbo people themselves aren't aware of. So you're sort of a custodian in that sense, as well as a creative writer who's also crafting, a beautiful text. And I wonder, when you're approaching these kinds of projects, what do you feel in terms of responsibility to these ways of seeing the world or being in the world?
They're really, I feel like that is really, I mean, I hope to broaden my range. I'm working on a collection of short stories, which my short stories tend to be more of like mostly rooted in pure realism, or some kind of realism. But in longer form fiction, I'm just completely committed to that vision, to bring in, as you said, this non-respected or even unacknowledged worldview. I do it not just for the Igbo one, but also the Yoruba, because I was born in Akure. I grew up speaking Yoruba, even more than I spoke Igbo. So I see myself as a kind of a custodian of both culture. So I have almost no interest in the Western structures and political beliefs and socio-political narratives. So I think that in fact the key to whatever we are going to achieve as a people, as Ndibo, but also as Nigerians, as Africans, is in going back to understanding who we are, who we were. So for how many years we've tried to have a country structured around foreign countries. So Nigeria has a federal system which apes America. What is funny is that nobody asks us, okay, do you have the same worldview as us people? Are the structures the same? Are the dynamics the same? Are the people even the same? So can it work? So we impose that structure on a people whose worldview, even though it is developing to becoming like that of those people, but still in Nigeria, if you go here to Nigeria today and look at Nollywood, the predominant narrative in Nollywood is that there is a supernatural world, a supernatural context. Almost all our films, okay, well, it's changing. Half of our films still imbibe this worldview. When, if you go to somebody on the street of London or New York, millennials, the idea of the supernatural is a joke to them. I mean, they cannot conceive of that. So, and then you have the same political system with those people. So you have to look at what can work within the frame of the worldview. Maybe one day when we become like them, when we see the world completely as them, then we can have the same, political structure. So you adapt it to what the people believe. If you look at Saudi Arabia, say what you will about Saudi Arabia, it is an extraordinarily wealthy country. It is doing very well. What do you want? You want a society where your people are not in perpetual lack. They can actually have their well-being. We don't have that in Nigeria. So there are systems, there are ways of living. For instance, I keep saying, okay, so our people, our governors swear by the Bible before they are elected in. Nobody cares. Why swearing by the Bible? In fact, some people, you can be stealing, you can be, there are pastors who commit all kinds of, corrupt practices. They don't have that much respect for that. But ask a governor, you have to go and take a blood oath at the Okija shrine. If you steal, something will happen to you. You will see that just make that a requirement. You will immediately cut by half or even more those who will want to be politicians in Igbo land, because there's reverence, true reverence for that. You believe that if you swear by the Okija shrine, something will happen. So these are things that we've forgotten, but they actually would work for us if we should follow those. So in some ways, I'm trying to make the argument that, look, the idea of modernity as exclusive concept to the West is wrong. There are modernities, different modernities, and we completely neglecting our traditions and some of the good things. Of course, there were bad things, but, killing of twins, polygamy. There are some things that, of course, have to go. But there are some things that if we have today, our society will be better off 10 times than it is now.
And I wonder if that, just to return to a question I asked about sort of your what I'm calling your tragic vision, I wonder if that feeds into it, if there's a sense of a disease in society in the way that things are moving forward, in the abandonment of some practices that were actually helpful, fruitful, were based in people's experiences and have evolved to serve a certain set of people. If that has been abandoned, and if there's a kind of aimlessness to where Nigeria is now, I wonder if that, maybe I'm drawing a tangential link, but does that feed into your work? And sort of and if it doesn't, if that's not, if I'm off point here.
No, it does feed in. It does feed in, yes.
But I'm just wondering what draws you to the sort of more tragic tales. Yeah. What is it about those stories that really resonate with you?
That are tragic. So there are two reasons why my work. So I told the Guardian that when I was starting An Orchestra of Minorities, I told myself that I was no longer going to write stories that end in a dark way, even though I make the argument all the time that The Fisherman is not a tragic novel. But despite that, everybody argues that somebody wrote a wonderful essay. I don't read reviews, but somebody wrote a wonderful essay, The Rebirth of Tragedy, looking at two of my work. And I found myself nodding. But, my definition of tragedy is a somewhat different from the Aristotelian one. I believe that something is broken does not mean it is not tragic in itself. When something is tragic is when it cannot be mended again. So you can you can have an accident, destroy your car. But I experienced that, last year. They remade the car, and it's even better than it used to look before. So how can you call that a tragedy? But when something is broken in a way that it can no longer be mended, then we are in a tragic state. So to some extent, towards the end of the fishermen, a new generation is born. Even though something tragic has happened, but the two little children grow up, they become, and the brothers come back together. So I tend to disagree that it's a tragic work. Though, obviously, in many ways, An Orchestra of Minorities is. So the reason for that, though, is because, number one, I am I'm looking beyond these characters. I'm looking at, I'm using them not as allegories, but I'm creating a kind of a metaphor for Nigeria, for instance, in The Fishermen, and for the Igbo civilization in An Orchestra of Minorities. So these are big things. When you're writing about an entire country, and an entire civilization, because I see the Igbo, as a civilization, as well as an ethnic group, as well as a tribe, as well as a nation. So then you are tackling something that is beyond, that is very large in scope. It is beyond, just the quotidian structures of a novel. If I was just writing a love story between two people, of course, the themes will be love, and hate or whatever, immigration. But An Orchestra of Minorities is way beyond that. It's a story of a people, it's a history of the Igbo people. The G is a chronicle of 700 years. It talks about all the landmark events in the Igbo, history. Through its own experience, one time it's a slave in North America. One time it's fighting in the Biafra War. So it's much more than that. So I find that when I'm tackling things like that, the vision becomes darkened. In my short stories, you don't really see that. But because of the scope, I think it always turns that way. But another reason could be that I read in my formative years a lot of Shakespeare, and Shakespeare is known more for his tragic works than his comedic works. So I'm sure that I unconsciously internalize some of the structures of fiction or storytelling from there. So, which might also be, one of the reasons why I write in this way. But it's not intentional, really. I just find that by the time I finish a novel, it has arrived, into that dark place. Look at the boisterous, joyous beginning of The Fisherman, and then where we end up at the end of the day, for instance.
And just on that note, actually, I was interested to sort of get a sense of the literary tradition that you see your work within. So who are you mentioned Shakespeare as an influence, but who are your sort of literary forefathers and foremothers, and what conversations do you see your books, or which other texts do you see your books being in conversation with?
Well, I think that some of my so obviously writers who have written in the same space or domain, I'm working in that same realm. So obviously Achebe, Eleji Amadi, to some extent, even Cyprian Ekwensi, for instance, these are writers who wrote about pre-colonial Igbo world. Arrow of God, for instance, is very interesting and amazing in the way in which it contextualizes that world. I have a novel that will be set in the 11th century Igbo world, something that, nobody has even thought of. I mean, though I think that some Nollywood films have come close, but they usually will hover around the 17th, 18th century. But I'm going further back. So in that way, I write within that. I see those people as precursors. But then, as I said, I find that one aspect of my work that I am probably just as committed to as I am to bringing the Igbo worldview to be realized on page is what I call writing audacious prose. So I believe that the novel is a work of art. I know that I exist in a contemporary time when people see the novel as a tool for political arguments, and hear sloganeering about the novel should be a tool for this and that. But no, I think that the first reason for the novel's existence is that it's an artwork. So I want my language to achieve that poetic intensity. And for that, I look to some masters outside of the shores of Africa for that as my influences. So I really admire The God of Small Things by Arundhati Roy. I think that she excels in exuberant prose. Salman Rushdie too, whom I became friends with, last year because we were shortlisted for the book out together. I feel like these are people who push the limit of language. But I can say the same of writers like Virginia Woolf, Nabokov, and some of these, Faulkner, obviously, Cormac McCarthy, and the rest of them. So Shakespeare, obviously, the grandiosity of language is something that I find it's probably the number one reason why I was drawn to writing in the first place.
And then you sort of spoke there a bit to, yes, obviously your works being regarded as not just vehicles to convey, messages about, cosmology, but actually works of art in their own right. And I think sometimes, people can be focused on, exploring new worlds and maybe not spend enough time actually thinking about the way in which these worlds are crafted by the writers as well. But I wanted to talk a bit about how you perceive yourself as a writer, as a Nigerian writer in diaspora, and the kind of relationship with home that you have. You spoke a bit about your sort of vision for Nigeria, and you spoke a bit about how the state of Nigeria now is affecting or impacts or influences how you write. So what do you see as your relationship as a writer to your community in Nigeria?
Well, I see myself as a kind of so I'm a storyteller and artist. That is the first thing. But I'm writing about this subject, about these people, and so in many ways, I am exploring the same world that they're exploring. So I discussed last year in London. I said that the way I joke about myself or what I do, when I speak with my friends, some of them who are doctors and engineers, and they ask me, well, why are you doing this? You just You are the nerd who writes. So I'm like, well, imagine that all of us are walking on a path, somewhere. You guys are busy. We're living in the world, you're watching things, you're observing things, you're experiencing things, but you're so busy with actually doing things that you are not noticing some of the things that I am seeing. So I am the one who, while you are like seeing the buildings, I am looking at the footprints. I'm looking at the gradations of soil on the path. I'm looking at, the species of grass and flower and fauna that are on the edge of the road. This is the difference. So I am taking stock of the small details of the world that both of us are experiencing. So that is the difference between me and you. So you can take that as a kind of a parable for how I see myself. So, which means that I think that my duty is to realize on the page the world as it is, not as it ought to be. So this Igbo worldview and all of these things is the world as it is. It is the way that Nigerians see the world. That is what I'm realizing. The structure I give it is a different thing. That is a work of art. The way in which I tell the story. Which is why I find it difficult when somebody says that they want to write a novel to change, the world. Or to bring about a particular understanding of the world. What are you talking about? If I were to, you have to document what are you seeing, what are you observing about human nature. That is what you need to write about. That is what you put down. Because if I were to create, if I were to write about Nigeria, how it ought to be, then the way I will create Nigeria will be such that British people will be jumping on ships to come to Nigeria, rather than the other way around. Because I love the country. I want it to be the best place in the world. But by the time I write that novel, even Nigerians will look at it and be like, man, this guy is a joke. This is fantasy that you have created. It is not true. So you cannot create literary truth when you have a propaganda or some kind of agenda. But, we're in the world where we're in a time when such things that are unheard of. Not that they're unheard of. There's always been propagandist novels, but it has gotten some kind of steam. So I don't see my work that way, which is to say that because I don't see myself that way, I am just observing the world as it is, then I don't have any service to anybody. That means that I'm not writing for any group. I'm not writing for Igbo people. I'm not writing for Africans. I'm not writing for, British people. I'm not writing for white people or anybody. It is the service to the world that, is a work of art that is being produced and rendered. Okay, so this is the picture that I have seen. It is my view, of the world. Take it, read it, and see if you can recognize the world that I have painted for you. So that is what I'm doing. So, a lot of people have said, people have attacked some of us who live abroad. You know what I'm talking about? Okay, because you live here, then you're writing for this. And some of this nonsensical debate that came up here and there, but that is obviously not true. Maybe some people are doing that, but not me. So I see myself as just somebody who documents. As I said, the idea of the chi, this is something that has been there for maybe 1,000 years. I am just documenting it now, but it's always been there,
And I'm just to build on that, I'm just thinking also of like Achebe's generation and many of the writers of that generation, had a particular sense of their written work as serving a particular kind of social function, but also beyond their written work, actually were getting politically engaged with the space. And I wonder if you have a sense of that amongst your generation. Do writers of your generation now express themselves primarily through their texts and other mediums, or is there still that sense of political engagement beyond the realm of being a writer? And maybe where you see yourself in that?
I mean, it is true that reaching a wider audience means that you have some form of platform. Then, as a person, you can talk, you can say about your ideas. Elechi Amadi, I liked what he had to say. He said that the novel is an expensive form to have. How did he say? Let me actually read it here. He said, the committed novelist should know that as a propaganda tool, the novel is at best inefficient and expensive. It is like sweeping the streets with brooms of gold. I agree wholeheartedly. So outside of the novel, in nonfiction or in speeches, of course, if you are willing to take up a particular subject, for sure, you should participate in holding our leaders accountable. That is a good thing to do, I think, if you can do it in a fair way, rather than, becoming tribal and choosing a particular group and then, fighting some kind of tribal political warfare. So I see myself as that. And to speak of how the tragic vision again of Nigeria and all that, in some ways, my novels pathologize Nigeria. It sees it as use your term, disease, or it's a diseased place. So, which is in fact true. Everybody, if you go to the street in Agege, even an uneducated person will tell you that something is wrong here. So we seeing that as well. Obviously, we can talk about it. So, I speak to that, but I think that speaking most of the times is posturing. As I said in the pre-discussion we had before the recording began, Wole Soyinka, for instance, jailed for the cause of Nigeria, has been criticizing every leader who has ever come. But what change has come? Nigeria has become poorer and worse by the day. So now it's even worse. Somebody will just come and tweet. Tweet. What does it even mean? So everybody will be like, oh, he's speaking out. That is amazing. She is, speaking out. But I can speak out on 1 million things in a day that I don't care about. It doesn't mean anything. So I am more interested in the engagement. What can you do? So accountability. So tell me how, if I go there, even if I'm an angel, is sent from heaven, it would be foolishness if you go into that position of power and then you say, okay, let me live by some principle. Your people will even laugh at you. How stupid can you be? Oh, Chigozie went there and look at it. He didn't do anything for our people. And then the next time they criticize, oh, look at that governor. All he does is he only provides for his people. You just criticize this man who did not do something for your people, when he's supposed to be the governor of the whole state 5 minutes ago. Now you are, criticizing this one who is doing the same thing you expect. So this is because there is no true accountability in Nigeria. If I can get the government of all the major countries in Europe to ban anybody like that, and their family, don't let anybody who is even tainted by any kind of corruption, corrupt practice, politician in Nigeria, from stepping into your country. if they know that they can never go anywhere, if they know that they can't come to America to have fun, next time they will think again. Even if our government cannot provide accountability, you know, if we can get accountability from the outside, that is something. So that is what I'm devoting my energy to. Not going and making fancy speeches or, you know, tweeting. I don't even have Twitter anymore. You know, so that's what I'm doing, really.
Thank you very much. And that's interesting, just thinking about the theme of disruption, the disruptions that coronavirus has brought about, people having to stay put and dealing with the fallout of not having that kind of mobility, particularly people in power. So it's interesting what emerges out of that. But thank you so much for joining me for this conversation. And hopefully one day we can do it in person.
Yes, no, I do hope so.
And the world opens up.
Yeah.
Thank you.